A millionaire kicked his son out of his mansion for getting a waitress pregnant. However, when he visited his son months later, he was paralyzed by what he saw. Joseph Morgan stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his luxurious Los Angeles mansion, gazing at the city skyline. The golden glow of sunset reflected off the glass of the towering skyscrapers, casting long shadows over the empire he had built from the ground up. His name, Morgan, was more than just a name. It was a brand, a legacy, a symbol of power, wealth, and control. And Joseph had spent his entire life ensuring that nothing, no one, could ever tarnish it. With a slow inhale, he turned his back to the view, hands clasped behind him. His study, a massive room lined with mahogany shelves and adorned with expensive artifacts, exuded authority. Everything in this house, in this life, had been carefully curated to project strength. Joseph Morgan did not tolerate weakness. The door opened. "Sir, your son is here," the butler announced, standing stiffly at the threshold. Joseph exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Joshua Morgan, his only son, his greatest disappointment. Joshua had grown up with every privilege money could buy. Elite boarding schools, the best universities, private mentors handpicked by Joseph himself. He was supposed to be the next in line, the one to take over the empire and continue the Morgan legacy. But no matter how much Joseph tried, Joshua had never quite measured up. Too soft, too emotional, too unwilling to embrace the ruthlessness required to survive in their world. And now, he had made the worst mistake of his life. Joshua entered the study with cautious steps, his broad shoulders stiff, his jaw set. Joseph studied his son carefully. He had inherited the signature Morgan features: sharp cheekbones, piercing blue eyes, the same confident stance. But his expression carried something Joseph wasn't used to seeing in him: defiance. "You wanted to see me?" Joshua asked, keeping his voice even. Joseph let the silence stretch between them. He walked over to his massive oak desk, his fingers grazing the polished surface before finally speaking. "I assume you know why you're here?" Joshua let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. "Dad, listen." Joseph cut him off. "You got a waitress pregnant." Joshua flinched at the venom in his father's voice. "Her name is Megan," he said firmly. "And yes, she's pregnant. We're having a baby." Joseph's grip tightened on the edge of his desk. "A child. A Morgan. Do you even understand what you've done?" Joseph's voice was dangerously low. "Do you realize what this means for the family, for the business, for everything I have built?" Joshua's gaze didn't waver. "It means I'm going to be a father," he said, his voice laced with conviction. "It means I'm going to take responsibility for my child, whether you approve or not." Joseph let out a cold, humorless laugh. "Responsibility." He stepped closer. He stepped, his presence towering over Joshua. "Do you even understand what that word means? You were born into wealth, into privilege. You have never had to fight for anything in your life. And now, you think you can just throw it all away for some woman who saw an opportunity and took it." Joshua clenched his fists. "That's not true. Megan isn't after money. She didn't even know who I was when we met." Joseph's expression darkened. "Then she got lucky, because now she's carrying a child with my name. And whether you understand it or not, that comes with power. It comes with a price." Joshua shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. "Not everything is about power and control, Dad. Not everything is a business deal. Some things, real things, are built on love, not manipulation." Joseph's jaw tightened. "Love?" he scoffed. "You sound like your mother." Joshua's expression hardened. "Maybe that's not such a bad thing." The room fell into a heavy silence. Joseph stepped back, his face unreadable. Then, with slow precision, he walked to his desk and pulled open a drawer. He took out a sleek black leather folder and placed it on the surface. "Fine," he said coldly. "If you want to throw away your future, do it. But you will do it without my name." "Without my money," Joshua's heart pounded in his chest. "What?" "I am cutting you off," Joseph stated, his tone absolute. "No more inheritance, no more access to Morgan Enterprises. You are no longer my son." Joshua stared at him, the weight of those words pressing down on him like a crushing force. For a brief moment, Joseph thought he saw something flicker in his son's eyes. Pain, hesitation, doubt. But then it was gone. Joshua straightened his spine, squared his shoulders. "Fine," he said, his voice steady. "If that's what it takes to be a real man, then I'll do it. I'll prove to you that I don't need your money. I don't need any of this to build a life of my own." Joseph smirked, shaking his head. "We'll see how long that lasts." Joshua didn't say another word. He turned on his heel and strode out of the study, his footsteps echoing down the grand hallway. Joseph stood motionless, staring at the door long after it had closed. This was necessary. There was no room for weakness in the Morgan family, no room for mistakes. And yet, as Joseph turned back to the towering windows, looking out over the city he ruled, for the first time in years, the view felt hollow. The Morgan mansion had never felt so empty. The grand hallways, once filled with purpose and motion, now echoed only with the sound of Joshua's footsteps as he made his way to his bedroom. His father's words still rang in his ears. Sharp, final, irrevocable. "You are no longer my son." He clenched his fists, his heart pounding with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He had always known that his father was cold, but this, cutting him off completely, it was more than Joshua had expected, even from Joseph Morgan. He pushed open the heavy wooden door to his room, a space that had once been his sanctuary. The massive king-sized bed, the custom-designed furniture, the walls adorned with framed memories of a life of privilege. All of it felt suffocating now. He had minutes to pack. There was no telling how far his father would go to make sure he left as soon as possible. Joshua didn't doubt that security would show up to escort him out if he took too long. He grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and started stuffing clothes inside. His movements rushed, erratic. How did everything spiral so fast? Just yesterday, he had a future, a plan. Maybe not one that fit his father's mold, but at least something he could work with. Now, he had nothing. Nothing except Megan. The thought of her steadied him. She was waiting for him in the small apartment she rented in Austin, the one she had shyly invited him into months ago, when their relationship was still new, still filled with stolen moments and quiet conversations about dreams and what-ifs. He wasn't going to let her down. A knock on the door made him freeze. He expected security, but when he turned, it was his mother standing there. Eleanor Morgan was the opposite of her husband in many ways. Where Joseph was all steel and fire, Eleanor had always been warmth and quiet strength. Her presence had been a rare comfort in his childhood, though even she had never been able to stand up fully against his father's dominance. She stepped inside, her silk robe flowing behind her, concern etched across her delicate features. "Joshua," she murmured, voice tight. "I just spoke to your father. He told me what happened." Joshua let out a sharp breath, shoving more clothes into his bag. "Then you know I have to go." Eleanor hesitated before walking closer. "I don't agree with what he's doing," she admitted, lowering her voice. "But you know how he is. He sees this as betrayal, as weakness. She faltered. "He doesn't know how to handle love that isn't conditional." Joshua zipped his bag and threw it over his shoulder. "Then I'm done trying to make him understand. I'm not going to beg, Mom. I made my choice. Megan and I are having this baby, whether he likes it or not." Her eyes glistened with emotion. "And what about you? How are you going to survive? You've never lived without this, without his money, without his protection. I don't want to see you struggle." Joshua forced a small smile. "I guess I'll have to learn. The way he did. The difference is, I won't become him." Eleanor's expression cracked for a moment, pain flashing through her features. Joshua knew she had suffered under Joseph's rule for years. There was a part of him that wished she could escape too. She reached into the pocket of her robe and pulled out a sleek black envelope. "Take this." Joshua frowned as she extended it toward him. "What is it? A bank card? I opened an account in your name years ago in case something like this ever happened." His stomach twisted. "Mom, I can't." "You can," she interrupted. "I know your pride, Joshua, but you're going to be a father. You have responsibilities now, and you need to think about Megan and that baby first. Don't let your stubbornness take away your options." He hesitated, then took the envelope. He hated that he needed it, but he had Megan to think about now. Eleanor touched his cheek gently. "I love you. That won't change." A lump formed in his throat. "I love you too, Mom." Before either of them could say more, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Joshua turned just in time to see security guards approaching. His father really wasn't going to let him leave on his own terms. Eleanor stepped back, composing herself as the guards stopped at the doorway. The lead guard, Dawson, a man Joshua had known for years, gave a professional nod, but there was an edge of discomfort in his eyes. "Mr. Morgan," Dawson said carefully, "your father has asked us to escort you off the premises." Joshua exhaled, tightening his grip on his bag. "I was already leaving." He walked past them without another word. Descending the grand staircase for the last time, he felt the weight of finality pressing on him. The chandeliers overhead, the polished marble floors, the priceless artwork that adorned the walls. It had all once been his world, but it was never really his, was it? The front doors loomed ahead, two massive mahogany slabs that had always symbolized power and exclusivity. Now, they were simply a barrier he needed to cross. The butler opened them as he approached, and cold night air hit his face like a slap. The driveway stretched before him, a long path leading away from the estate. At the end of it, his car was waiting, the one thing still in his name. He glanced back only once. Joseph Morgan stood at the top of the stairs watching him leave, his expression unreadable. Joshua didn't pause. He walked forward, one step after another, until he reached his car, throwing his bag into the passenger seat. He slid behind the wheel, gripping the steering wheel tightly. This was it. A new life. No turning back. He started the engine and pulled away from the only home he had ever known. As he drove, his phone buzzed on the console. Megan's name lit up the screen. He picked it up, bringing it to his ear. "Hey," he said, his voice softer now. "Hey," Megan replied. "Are you okay?" Joshua exhaled slowly, eyes focused on the road ahead. "I will be." The Austin skyline came into view as Joshua drove through the dimly lit streets, his fingers gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. It had been a long drive, one filled with silence, thoughts that refused to settle, and the nagging weight of uncertainty pressing against his chest. He was no longer Joshua Morgan, heir to an empire. He was just Joshua, a man trying to figure out his next steps. As he pulled into the small parking lot of Megan's apartment complex, the reality of his situation sank deeper. The building was modest, the kind of place he had never imagined himself living in. But this was his life now, and if he was being honest, there was something oddly liberating about that. He turned off the engine and took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. The Texas air was thick and warm, carrying the faint scent of rain that had passed earlier. He grabbed his bag from the passenger seat and made his way toward Megan's unit, his heart pounding a little harder than he wanted to admit. Before he could knock, the door swung open. Megan stood there, her hazel eyes filled with relief, her long brown hair falling over her shoulders in loose waves. She wore a simple oversized sweatshirt and leggings, her expression a mix of concern and quiet strength. "You made it," she breathed, stepping aside to let him in. Joshua gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah, barely." The apartment was small, really small, but it had warmth, cozy furniture, a few picture frames on the walls, a faint smell of vanilla and cinnamon lingering in the air. It was nothing like the mansion he had left behind, but somehow, it felt more like home than that place ever had. Megan closed the door behind him, watching him carefully. How did it go? Joshua dropped his bag near the couch and ran a hand through his hair. About as bad as you'd expect. "He cut me off completely. No money, no inheritance, nothing." He let out a hollow laugh. "I think he actually enjoyed doing it." Megan frowned, stepping closer. "I'm so sorry, Josh." He shook his head. "Don't be, I knew this was coming." He glanced around the apartment, suddenly hyper-aware of the shift in his reality. I don't know how to do this." Megan reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "You don't have to do it alone." Her words settled something in him, grounding him in the moment. They sat down on the couch, and Joshua leaned back, exhaling slowly. Megan studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You know you can stay here as long as you need," she said gently. Joshua nodded. "I appreciate that." Megan hesitated before adding, "But we also need to talk about what comes next. We're having a baby, Josh. We need a plan." He knew she was right, He couldn't just wing it and hope for the best. He needed a job, a steady income, a way to build something real without his father's fortune behind him. "I'll find work," he said, determination creeping into his voice. "Something stable, it won't be easy, but I'll figure it out." Megan squeezed his hand. "We'll figure it out together." The next morning, Joshua woke up earlier than expected, his body still adjusting to the unfamiliar surroundings. He had crashed on Megan's couch, but even the discomfort of the small space wasn't enough to bother him. It was his first morning truly on his own. By the time Megan came out of the bedroom, he was already dressed and standing in the tiny kitchen, staring at the coffee maker as if it held the answers to his life. "You're up early," she noted, yawning as she tied her hair into a messy bun. Joshua turned, offering a small grin. "Figured I should get started on finding a job." Megan grabbed a mug and poured herself some coffee. "Any idea where you'll start?" Joshua exhaled. "Not really, but I guess I'll take what I can get." Megan hesitated for a moment before setting her mug down. "I might have an idea." He raised a brow. "Yeah." She bit her lip. "There's a bakery not far from here. The owner, Mrs. Carter, is always looking for help. It's nothing fancy, but you like baking, and you're good at it." Joshua blinked. "You want me to work at a bakery?" Megan shrugged. "Why not? You always talk about how much you love making bread, and let's be honest, Josh. You need a job, and this is a place where you won't have to deal with your father's world." He considered it for a moment. The idea of working at a small-town bakery was the exact opposite of everything he had been raised for. He had spent his life learning how to run a multi-billion-dollar corporation. Not knead dough, but then again, wasn't that the point? Joshua nodded slowly. "Okay, let's go check it out." An hour later, they arrived at Carter's Bakery, a quaint little shop nestled between a bookstore and a flower shop. The smell of fresh bread and pastries wafted through the air as they stepped inside, and for the first time in days, Joshua felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. Behind the counter, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a warm smile wiped her hands on her apron before looking up. "Well, if it isn't Megan Foster," she said with a teasing grin. "What brings you here, sweetheart?" Megan smiled. "Hi, Mrs. Carter. I actually came to see if you're still looking for help." Mrs. Carter raised a brow, glancing between them. "You looking for work, honey?" Joshua cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a moment. "You ever worked in a bakery before?" Joshua hesitated. "Not exactly, but I can learn." Mrs. Carter smirked. "You got strong hands, know how to follow directions." Joshua chuckled. "I think so." She nodded. "All right then. Show up tomorrow morning at 5. We'll see what you're made of." Joshua blinked. 5 in the morning, Mrs. Carter laughed. "Welcome to bakery life, sweetheart." Megan squeezed his arm, grinning. "You're gonna do great." As they left the shop, Joshua felt something unfamiliar stirring inside him. For the first time since leaving his father's house, he didn't feel lost. This wasn't the future he had planned. But maybe, just maybe, it was the future he needed. The alarm blared at 4:30 a.m., jarring Joshua out of his sleep. His body protested immediately, his muscles stiff from the night spent on Megan's couch, his mind foggy from exhaustion. For a moment, he forgot where he was. Then it all came rushing back. No mansion, no business meetings, no driver waiting outside to take him to a corporate office. Just him, Megan, and a bakery job he had never imagined himself taking. He sat up, rubbing his face. The apartment was still dark, the only sound the occasional hum of cars passing outside. Megan was asleep in the bedroom. Curled up under the blankets, he resisted the urge to crawl back under the warmth with her. Not today. Not when he had something to prove. Quietly he got dressed, a simple t-shirt and jeans, and grabbed his keys. As he slipped on his sneakers, he caught sight of a small sticky note on the kitchen counter. "You got this, Mom." A small smile tugged at his lips. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket before heading out the door. By the time he arrived at Carter's Bakery, the sky was still dark, the streets eerily quiet. The small shop's front windows glowed warmly against the dim morning, a stark contrast to the cold, lifeless boardrooms he was used to. Joshua took a deep breath before pushing open the door. Inside, the scent of yeast, cinnamon, and freshly baked bread filled the air, wrapping around him like an invisible embrace. There was something comforting about it, something he hadn't expected behind the counter. Mrs. Carter was already at work, kneading dough with practiced ease. She barely glanced up as he entered. 5 on the dot, good start, kid. Joshua forced a grin. Didn't think you'd actually be watching the clock. She smirked, wiping her hands on her apron. This business is all about timing. You show up late. You mess up the whole day. She gestured for him to follow her into the kitchen, where trays of pastries and loaves of bread lined the metal counters. All right, she said, handing him an apron. Let's see what you can do. Joshua tied the apron around his waist, suddenly aware of how out of place he felt. He had spent years mastering financial reports, strategic expansions, investment portfolios. None of that meant a damn thing in here. Mrs. Carter handed him a lump of dough. First lesson, kneading. You ever done this before? Joshua stared at the sticky mass in his hands. Not exactly, she chuckled. She didn't think so. All right. Press with the heel of your palm, fold it over, press again. Keep going. Joshua tried to mimic her movements, but his technique was stiff, awkward. The dough stuck to his fingers, refusing to cooperate. Mrs. Carter sighed. You're fighting it. Joshua frowned. I'm trying to control it. She gave him a knowing look. That's your problem. He exhaled sharply. Control. That was how he had been raised, how his father had shaped him. Control everything, or everything controls you. But dough wasn't numbers on a spreadsheet. It didn't bend to formulas and strategies. It had a rhythm of its own, something he had to feel rather than force. He took a breath and tried again, easing into the motion. This time, the dough moved more naturally beneath his hands. Mrs. Carter watched him closely, then nodded in approval. Better. You keep that up and maybe you'll actually be useful around here. Joshua huffed a small laugh. I'll take that as a compliment. They worked in companionable silence, the steady rhythm of kneading and shaping filling the space between them. It was physical work, repetitive, yet oddly satisfying. Hours passed in a blur of rolling, shaping, flour dusting, and baking. Joshua lost himself in the motions, in the heat of the ovens, in the steady pace of the morning rush as customers began trickling in. He wasn't just watching from the outside, he was part of it, and for the first time in a long time, he felt useful. By noon, Joshua had flour in his hair, sweat on his brow, and a sore ache in his arms. But he also had a tray of perfectly golden croissants in front of him. Mrs. Carter inspected them with a critical eye, then gave a small nod. Not bad for a first day. Joshua wiped his hands on a towel. So, does that mean I still have a job? She smirked. You show up tomorrow, we'll see. He grinned, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment. It wasn't the kind of success he had chased his whole life, but maybe that wasn't a bad thing. As he untied his apron, he noticed Megan standing near the entrance, watching him with an amused smile. Look at you, she teased as he approached. Covered in flour and actually looking happy? Joshua chuckled. It's weird, right? She tilted her head. Not really. I think it suits you. They stepped outside together, the Texas sun hot and bright against their skin. So, she said, nudging his shoulder. What did you think? Joshua looked down at his hands, still dusted with flour, then out at the city around him. It's not what I expected, he admitted. But maybe that's a good thing. Megan smiled. I have a feeling this is just the beginning. Joshua felt it too. Maybe this wasn't just about survival. Maybe it was about building something real. Not just a job, not just a paycheck, but a future. And for the first time since leaving his father's house, that future didn't feel impossible. It felt like his. The smell of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the air as the bakery doors swung open, welcoming the first wave of customers. The early morning rush was a daily ritual at Carter's Bakery, a steady flow of regulars, each with their own favorite pastry, their own routine, their own stories. Joshua had been working here for almost 2 weeks now, and though his body still ached from the relentless early mornings, something about the rhythm of it all felt right. There was a predictability in the way dough rose, in the way the ovens hummed, in the way customers always smiled when they took the first bite of something warm and sweet. It was nothing like the chaotic, high-pressure world he had left behind, and yet, this mattered in a way he had never expected. The bell above the door jingled, signaling another customer. Joshua looked up from the counter just in time to see Mrs. Carter walking out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "All right, Morgan," she said, her sharp eyes assessing him. "Time for a test." Joshua raised an eyebrow, brushing some flour off his hands. "A test," she smirked. "You've been here long enough. Let's see if you can handle making the bakery's bestseller on your own." Joshua's stomach twisted slightly. He had spent days learning the recipes, kneading dough, working alongside Mrs. Carter and the other employees, trying to keep up. But now, on his own, Mrs. Carter crossed her arms. "You up for it? Or are you gonna choke?" A challenge. A small grin tugged at Joshua's lips. "What am I making?" "Cinnamon rolls from scratch, no help." Joshua exhaled. He had helped with the cinnamon rolls before, but Mrs. Carter had always been there, watching, correcting, making sure he didn't screw it up. This time, it was all on him, behind him. Megan sat at a small table near the window, sipping a cup of coffee as she watched the exchange with amusement. When he glanced at her, she gave him an encouraging nod. Joshua turned back to Mrs. Carter. "All right, let's do this." She gestured toward the prep station. "Clock's ticking, kid." Joshua rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He moved carefully, measuring out the ingredients from memory: flour, sugar, yeast, eggs, milk, butter, cinnamon, brown sugar. Simple enough. But the real challenge wasn't in the ingredients. It was in the process. He had learned that baking wasn't just about throwing things together and hoping for the best. It was patience. It was precision. He mixed the dough, watching as it came together under his hands. It was sticky at first. Too sticky. He added a little more flour, kneading it against the cool countertop. Working the dough until it became smooth and elastic, Mrs. Carter watched from a few feet away, her expression unreadable. Joshua focused. Press, fold, press. Let the dough breathe. Let it take shape. When it was ready, he rolled it out into a perfect rectangle, spreading the softened butter evenly across the surface. Then dusting it with cinnamon and brown sugar. He could still remember the first time he had done this. He had used too much filling, making a mess everywhere. This time, he got it right. He rolled the dough into a tight log and sliced it into spirals, each one nearly identical in size. The bakery smelled incredible as the rolls baked in the oven, the warm scent of cinnamon spreading through the shop. Joshua stood with his arms crossed, watching through the glass as the dough rose and the tops turned golden brown. When he pulled the tray out, he felt something strange in his chest. Pride. Not because it was a multi-million-dollar deal, not because he had just closed an important contract, because he had made something with his own hands and it was good. Mrs. Carter inspected the cinnamon rolls, then nodded. "Not bad," Joshua smirked. "I'll take it." She glanced at him. "Still a long way to go, but you're better than you were when you walked through that door." Joshua let out a small laugh. "That's a pretty low bar," she chuckled. "Maybe, but you're proving you can handle real work. That's more than I can say for most people who come in here looking for a job." The words hit him harder than he expected. For so long, his worth had been measured in money, in power, in influence. But now, he was earning respect for something real. Mrs. Carter patted his shoulder. "All right, enough standing around. Get back to work." Joshua nodded and got back behind the counter, just as the first rush of customers came in. By noon, the morning crowd had thinned, leaving behind the scent of baked goods and freshly brewed coffee. Joshua leaned against the counter, exhausted but satisfied. Megan walked up, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "You survived," she teased. Joshua chuckled, taking a sip. "Barely." She tilted her head. "You know, I think you actually like this," he exhaled, considering it. He had spent years chasing a future that had never felt quite right. Always trying to live up to his father's impossible expectations. Always feeling like he was never enough. But here, covered in flour, standing in a tiny bakery in a city his father had never even cared about, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. At peace, he nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think I do." Megan smiled. "Then maybe this isn't just a job. Maybe it's something more." Joshua looked around the bakery. The warmth of it, the familiarity, the quiet happiness in the faces of the customers. Maybe Megan was right. Maybe this was more than just a job. Maybe it was the beginning of something real. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid of that. Joseph Morgan sat alone in his expansive office, the city skyline stretching out before him through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The view had always been a source of pride, a reminder of the empire he had built with his own hands. Every deal, every decision, every sacrifice had been made to ensure his name carried weight, to secure a legacy that would outlast him. And yet, tonight, as he sat in the dim light of his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, that legacy felt hollow. It had been almost 2 weeks since Joshua had walked out of his life, 2 weeks since his son had turned his back on everything Joseph had built. Joseph had expected rage, anger that Joshua had been foolish enough to throw away his inheritance, to abandon the path laid out for him. Instead, what lingered in the pit of his stomach was something far worse: regret. At first, he had convinced himself that Joshua would fail, that he would crawl back the moment he realized how brutal life was without money, without influence, without power. But that phone call never came. There had been no desperate messages, no attempts to negotiate, no plea for forgiveness. Joshua was truly gone. Joseph swirled the amber liquid in his glass, staring at the reflection in the darkened window. He looked older than he remembered. The sharp angles of his face, once so strong, now seemed weighed down by something heavier than time. The mansion had been too quiet since Joshua left. Eleanor still moved through the halls like a shadow, her presence soft and distant. She hadn't spoken much to him since that night. She had always been the bridge between father and son, the quiet force that kept their strained relationship from completely unraveling. Now, that bridge was burned beyond repair. Joseph set his drink down and ran a hand through his graying hair. He had spent his entire life controlling everything: his business, his employees, his fortune, even his family. And yet, here he was, unable to control the one thing that mattered most. With a frustrated sigh, he pulled out his phone and hesitated before tapping on his assistant's contact. The moment the line connected, a crisp, professional voice filled the silence. "Yes, Mr. Morgan. Find out where Joshua is," he ordered. His voice firm despite the hesitation curling in his chest. There was a brief pause on the other end. "Sir, are you sure? I thought—" "Just do it," Joseph snapped, then hung up. He wasn't sure what he expected to find. Maybe he just needed proof that his son was struggling. Maybe he needed to see firsthand that Joshua had made a mistake, that life without the Morgan name was unbearable. Or maybe, just maybe, he needed to know that his son was okay. The thought made his chest tighten. He wasn't ready to confront what that meant. The next morning, Joseph arrived at his office earlier than usual. His assistant was already waiting for him, a folder in hand. "I have the information you requested," she said, passing it to him. Joseph hesitated before flipping it open. His eyes skimmed over the contents. An address in Austin, Texas, a small apartment complex, and a place called Carter's Bakery. He frowned. "A bakery?" His assistant nodded. "It seems Joshua has been working there for the past couple of weeks." Joseph sat back in his chair, staring at the report. Joshua working in a bakery. His mind struggled to process the idea. His son had grown up with private chefs, luxury vacations, the finest education money could buy. The idea of him covered in flour, waking up at dawn to bake bread, serving customers like some ordinary worker. It was absurd, and yet, he was doing it. Joseph's fingers tightened around the edge of the folder. This should have been proof of Joshua's failure, but instead, it felt like proof of something else entirely. He closed the folder abruptly. "I'll be out for the day," he announced. His assistant barely concealed her surprise but nodded. "Understood, sir." Joseph left the office and got into his car, instructing the driver to take him to the airport. The entire flight to Texas was spent in silence, his thoughts a tangled mess. He didn't know exactly what he would say when he saw Joshua. Would he demand that his son come home, offer him a second chance? Or was this just curiosity, a need to see, with his own eyes, the life Joshua had chosen over him? By the time the car pulled up outside Carter's Bakery, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows on the pavement. Joseph stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks as he took in the modest storefront. It was nothing like the places he was used to. No flashing signs, no grandeur, just a simple, warm-looking shop, the scent of fresh bread and coffee spilling onto the sidewalk. Through the window, he saw him, Joshua, wearing an apron. moving behind the counter with an ease that shocked Joseph to his core. He wasn't just working. He looked happy, Mrs. Carter said something to him and Joshua laughed. A genuine, unguarded laugh that Joseph hadn't heard in years. And then, Megan appeared. She was carrying a small tray of pastries, her free hand resting on the slight curve of her stomach. Joshua turned to her, smiling in a way Joseph had never seen before. Soft, content, completely at peace. Joseph's throat tightened. This was the moment he had imagined for years. Watching his son struggle. Watching him realize his mistake. Watching him come crawling back. But this wasn't that. Joshua wasn't struggling. He wasn't lost. He was thriving. For the first time, Joseph Morgan was the one on the outside looking in. His grip tightened on the door handle, his instincts screaming at him to storm inside, to demand that Joshua listen to him, to remind him of who he was, what he had given up. But instead, he let go. He took a step back, and then another. He turned and walked away. For the first time in his life, Joseph Morgan didn't know what to do. The afternoon rush at Carter's bakery was in full swing. The scent of cinnamon and fresh bread filled the air as customers lined up at the counter, chatting over steaming cups of coffee and warm pastries. The shop had become a familiar rhythm to Joshua, his hands working efficiently, his mind focused on each task. 2 weeks ago, he had felt like an outsider, unsure of himself in this new world. Now, he was moving through the bakery with a natural ease. He wasn't just getting by. He was thriving in a way he never had before. Mrs. Carter glanced at him as he slid a tray of croissants into the display case. "You're getting faster," she noted. Joshua grinned. "I had a good teacher," she smirked. "Damn right you did." Megan was sitting at her usual spot by the window, a cup of tea in front of her, one hand resting lightly on her growing belly. She had been coming in every afternoon, keeping him company between her shifts at the bookstore. Their baby would be here in just a few months, and the thought of it filled Joshua with a mix of excitement and nervousness. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the future. Everything felt right. And then, the door opened. The bell jingled softly, signaling a new customer. Joshua looked up out of habit, his hands still working on tying a bag of pastries for an elderly woman at the counter. And then he froze, standing just inside the door, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable, was Joseph Morgan. The breath left Joshua's lungs. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the bakery, like time had slowed to a crawl. His father, here, for a split second, he thought he was imagining it, that maybe exhaustion was playing tricks on his mind. But no, Joseph was really there, in his perfectly tailored suit. Looking out of place among the warmth of the bakery, Joshua hadn't seen him in weeks, not since the night he had walked out of the mansion for good. Not since his father had disowned him. And now, he was here. The bag of pastries nearly slipped from Joshua's fingers. Across the shop, Megan went still. Mrs. Carter noticed the shift in atmosphere, her gaze flickering between them before settling on the man by the door. "You know him?" she asked under her breath. Joshua swallowed, forcing himself to breathe. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "That's my father." Mrs. Carter's eyebrows shot up slightly, but she said nothing. She simply stepped aside, giving him the space to handle whatever this was. Joshua wiped his hands on his apron and took a step toward Joseph. His heart was pounding, his thoughts racing. "What are you doing here?" Joshua finally asked, his voice sharp but controlled. Joseph studied him for a long moment, his piercing blue eyes taking in everything. The flour dusted on his shirt, the apron tied around his waist, the way he stood confidently behind the counter, like he belonged here. It was clear that Joseph had not expected this. Finally, his father spoke. "I was in town," Joshua scoffed. "Right, because you just happened to be in Austin and happened to walk into this bakery." Joseph's jaw tensed. "I wanted to see how you were doing." Joshua let out a bitter laugh. "You mean you wanted to see if I had failed yet?" Silence hung between them. Across the room, Megan was watching, her hands clenched into fists on her lap. Joseph's gaze flickered toward her, then down to her stomach. Something in his expression shifted. So fast Joshua almost missed it. Joseph wasn't just seeing Megan this time. He was seeing his grandson. For the first time since his father walked in, Joshua felt a ripple of uncertainty pass through him. Why was Joseph really here? If he had come to gloat, to remind Joshua that he had made a mistake, then why did he look so hesitant? Joseph finally turned his attention back to Joshua. "You seem to be doing well." Joshua narrowed his eyes. "Would that disappoint you?" his father exhaled, his expression unreadable. No, Joshua wasn't sure if he believed that. For a long time, he had lived under his father's shadow, always measuring himself by Joseph's expectations. But standing here now, face to face, Joshua felt something he hadn't felt before. He felt free. Joseph might still have his wealth, his empire, his control, but he no longer had control over Joshua. The realization hit him hard and fast. He didn't need his father's approval. He didn't need his father's money. He had built something for himself, and Joseph knew it. Joshua took a step back, shaking his head. "If you came here to tell me I made a mistake, save your breath. I'm not going back." Joseph was quiet for a long moment. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, "I never said you made a mistake." Joshua froze again. For a brief moment, he saw something in his father's eyes. Something unfamiliar. Something he had never seen before. Regret. It was there for only a second before Joseph straightened, returning to the man Joshua had always known, the untouchable businessman, the father who never showed weakness. "I should go," Joseph said. "I just wanted to see for myself." Joshua let out a breath, his body still tense. "Yeah, I bet you did." Joseph hesitated, as if he wanted to say something else. But instead, he simply nodded once and turned toward the door. Before he stepped outside, he paused. Without looking back, he said, "Your mother asks about you." Then, just like that, he was gone. The bell jingled softly as the door swung shut behind him. Joshua stood frozen, his mind racing, his chest tight. Across the shop, Megan finally spoke. "Josh," but he couldn't find the words, because for the first time, he had seen a crack in his father's armor, and he wasn't sure what that meant. Joshua could still feel the tension in his body long after Joseph had left the bakery. The door had swung shut behind his father, but the weight of that encounter remained, pressing down on him like an invisible force. He turned back toward the counter, but the usual ease with which he moved through the bakery was gone. His hands felt stiff, his mind restless. Why had Joseph really come? What had he expected to find? More importantly, why hadn't he said more? Joshua had braced himself for the usual Morgan brand arrogance, the sharp-edged remarks, the disapproving glances, the not-so-subtle demands that he admit his mistake and return to the life he had abandoned. But Joseph hadn't done any of that. Instead, he had looked at Megan. He had looked at their child. And for a fleeting moment, Joshua had seen something in his father's face that had caught him completely off guard. Doubt, regret. Joshua rubbed a hand over his face. Exhaling slowly, Megan walked over to him, her expression careful. She had been watching the whole time, and Joshua could tell she was trying to gauge how he was feeling before she spoke. "That was unexpected," she said finally. Joshua let out a dry laugh. "You think?" Megan crossed her arms. "He looked different, not how I imagined." Joshua shook his head. "He's good at that. Walking in, making you think one thing, then leaving before you even figure out what just happened." She studied him for a moment, before reaching out and placing a hand on his arm. "Are you okay?" Joshua wanted to say yes, to brush it off like it didn't matter. But it did, because for years, his father had been the immovable force in his life. Joseph Morgan was a man who never wavered, never looked back. Yet today, he had. Joshua sighed. "I don't know." Megan nodded as if she understood, and maybe she did. "Are you going to talk to him?" she asked hesitantly. Joshua hesitated. His instinct was to say no, to shut that door just as Joseph had once shut him out. But the words "your mother asks about you" echoed in his mind. His mother. He hadn't spoken to her since he left. Not because he didn't want to, but because part of him feared what she might say. Would she blame him? Would she try to convince him to return? Or worse, would she be disappointed in him? "I don't know," he admitted. "I guess I wasn't expecting any of this." Megan squeezed his arm gently. "You don't have to figure it out right now." He nodded, though his mind was already tangled in a storm of thoughts. The rest of the afternoon dragged on. Joshua tried to focus, but his usual rhythm felt off. He made small mistakes, almost overbaking a batch of bread, forgetting an order at the register. Even Mrs. Carter noticed. By the time his shift ended, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work. When he and Megan returned to their apartment, the first thing Joshua did was collapse onto the couch. He stared at the ceiling, trying to sort through the mess in his head. Megan sat beside him, pulling her legs up onto the cushion. She didn't press him to talk, but he could feel her waiting, giving him space until he was ready. After a long silence, Joshua finally spoke. "You know, my whole life, I've been chasing his approval, even when I told myself I didn't care. I did. And now that I finally broke free, now that I'm actually happy, he suddenly shows up." Megan leaned her head against his shoulder. "Maybe he's realizing he made a mistake." Joshua scoffed. "Joseph Morgan doesn't make mistakes." Megan lifted her head and gave him a pointed look. "Are you sure about that?" Joshua hesitated. Because no, he wasn't sure anymore. His father had been so certain when he cut him off, so convinced that Joshua would fail, that he'd come crawling back. But that hadn't happened. And now, Joseph was the one showing up unannounced, standing in a bakery he had no business being in, looking at his son like he didn't recognize him anymore. Megan reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. What if this is the start of something different? What if he's finally realizing that he was wrong? Joshua let out a breath. "I don't know if I care anymore." But that was a lie. He did care, more than he wanted to admit. The problem was, caring had never brought him anything but disappointment, and he wasn't sure if he could afford that anymore. Just as he was about to say something else, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at it, expecting some work reminder or an email from the bank. But when he picked it up, his stomach clenched. "Mom?" Megan saw his reaction immediately. "Is it him?" Joshua shook his head slowly. "No, it's my mother." His thumb hovered over the screen. He hadn't heard her voice in weeks. Had she been waiting for him to reach out first? Had she been hoping he'd change his mind? Or was she just calling because Joseph told her about today? Megan squeezed his hand. "You don't have to answer." But Joshua knew he would, because this was his mother. And despite everything, despite the past, despite his anger, despite the distance, he missed her. Taking a deep breath, he swiped the screen and lifted the phone to his ear. "Hey, Mom." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, her voice, soft and warm. "Joshua." His chest tightened, and just like that, everything became even more complicated. Joshua gripped the phone tighter as his mother's voice filled his ear. It had been weeks since he'd heard her speak, and yet, in an instant, he was transported back to his childhood, back to the soft comfort of her words, back to the nights she had tucked him into bed, whispering that everything would be okay. Now, though, the warmth in her voice was laced with something heavier. Regret. "Mom," he said again, his voice uncertain, not knowing what to expect. There was a long pause on the other end, as if she were choosing her words carefully. "I didn't think you'd answer," she admitted, her tone gentle. Joshua exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, well, I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you," she said softly. After everything, another pause. This one stretched longer. Megan sat beside him on the couch, watching him carefully, not saying a word, but offering silent support. Joshua swallowed hard before speaking again. "Dad told you he came to see me." It wasn't a question. Eleanor sighed. "Yes." Joshua clenched his jaw. Of course, Joseph would have told her. He was still controlling the narrative, still making sure that even from a distance, Joshua's decisions didn't happen without his knowledge. "He said you're working in a bakery," Eleanor continued. "That you and Megan are doing well?" There was something hesitant in her voice, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to say it, allowed to acknowledge that Joshua had built something for himself outside of the Morgan name. Joshua glanced around the small apartment, at the modest furniture, at the simple life he and Megan were creating. It was nothing like the world he had grown up in, but for the first time, he didn't feel the need to defend it. "We are," he said simply. His mother was quiet for a moment. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear her, she whispered, "I'm glad." Something in Joshua's chest tightened. He had expected her to ask him to come home, to tell him that he was making a mistake. But she hadn't. She was glad. He shifted uncomfortably. "So, is this why you called, to check in?" Another pause. Then, her voice dropped slightly, more serious now. "No, Joshua. I called because there's something you need to know." Joshua's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" A deep breath on the other end. "It's about Megan." Joshua immediately tensed, every muscle in his body going rigid. Megan, who had been silent this whole time, straightened beside him. "What about her?" His mother hesitated, then finally said, "I knew her mother." Joshua blinked. "What?" Eleanor sighed. "A long time ago, before your father built the business into what it is today, he had a few trusted employees. One of them was a woman named Linda Foster. She was hardworking, dedicated, and she was loyal. I remember her well." Joshua's pulse quickened. "Megan's mother. What does that have to do with anything?" he asked, glancing at Megan, who was now sitting up straight, her face pale. Eleanor took another deep breath. "One day, Linda was fired. It happened suddenly, and no one really knew why. I didn't find out until much later that it was your father's decision." Joshua felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. Joseph, of course. His father had ruined another person's life, just like he had tried to ruin Joshua's. But before he could speak, his mother continued, "It wasn't until I started asking questions that I realized how unfair it was. Linda had done nothing wrong. But your father, he accused her of something. He said she was stealing from the company. I don't know if it was true or if it was just an excuse to get rid of her. But the moment she was fired, she disappeared." Joshua's fingers tightened around the phone. "You're telling me that my father destroyed Megan's mother's life?" Megan's breathing had grown shallow beside him. Joshua reached for her hand instinctively, gripping it tightly. "I don't know the full story," Eleanor admitted. "But Joshua, I think you need to find out." Joshua gritted his teeth. "Why didn't you stop him?" His mother's voice cracked slightly. "You know how he is." And that was the truth, wasn't it? Joseph Morgan made decisions, and no one questioned him. Not his employees, not his son, not even his wife. But Joshua wasn't that person anymore. He wasn't under Joseph's control. And now, knowing that Megan's mother had been one of his father's victims, the anger burning inside him reached a dangerous level. Megan suddenly got up from the couch, pacing the small space. Joshua could tell that she was struggling to process it all. "Megan," he said gently. She turned to him, shaking her head. "I need some air." Without waiting for a response, she grabbed her coat and stepped outside. Joshua watched her go, his heart twisting painfully. His mother's voice pulled him back. "Joshua, I don't know what you're thinking right now. But please, be careful. Your father, he doesn't like losing control." Joshua exhaled sharply. "Yeah, I know." Another silence stretched between them before his mother spoke again, this time softer. "I love you, Joshua. I always have." Joshua closed his eyes, the words hitting harder than he expected. "I love you too, Mom." And then the call ended. Joshua sat there for a long moment, staring at the phone in his hands, his thoughts racing. His father had destroyed Megan's mother's life, and now, Joshua had to figure out what he was going to do about it. Joshua sat in stunned silence long after the call ended. His mother's words echoed in his mind, refusing to settle. Linda Foster, fired by Joseph Morgan, accused of stealing, disappeared. Megan's mother, he had spent his entire life running from his father's shadow, desperate to be his own person, to carve out a future that didn't belong to the Morgan name. But no matter how far he ran, Joseph always found a way to weave himself into the story. And now, the woman he loved, the mother of his child, was connected to that same darkness. He exhaled sharply and ran a hand through his hair, his pulse pounding in his ears. He needed to talk to Megan, to tell her that no matter what, they would figure this out together. But when he turned, she was gone. Joshua pushed himself up from the couch and hurried outside. The evening air was cool, a soft breeze rustling the trees along the sidewalk. Megan stood near the edge of the apartment complex, her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the street with an expression he couldn't quite read. Joshua approached her carefully. "Megan." She didn't turn. "I just needed a minute." He hesitated before stepping closer. "I know, but I don't want you to go through this alone." Megan let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. alone. Josh, my entire life has been a lie. My mother never told me anything about this. She never mentioned your father, never said a word about why she lost her job. All these years, I thought she was just struggling like so many single mothers do. But now, she finally turned to face him, her hazel eyes filled with pain and uncertainty. Now I don't know what to think. Joshua swallowed the lump in his throat. He wanted to tell her that it didn't matter, that the past was the past, and they were building something better. But the truth was, it did matter. His father had ruined too many lives, and now that darkness had found its way back to them. "We're going to figure this out," he promised. Together. Megan held his gaze for a long moment, before finally nodding, but there was still something unsettled in her expression, something that told him this wasn't over. And deep down, he knew she was right. The next morning at Carter's bakery, Joshua threw himself into work, trying to shake off the weight pressing down on his chest. He focused on kneading dough, shaping pastries, filling orders, anything to keep his mind from spiraling. But no matter how hard he worked, the feeling wouldn't go away, Mrs. Carter noticed. "You're gonna break that dough in half if you keep at it like that," she muttered as she passed him. Raising an eyebrow, Joshua forced a smirk, just trying to make sure it's perfect. She studied him for a moment, then crossed her arms. This wouldn't have anything to do with that fancy-dressed man who came in here yesterday, would it? Joshua's stomach tightened. He hadn't talked to her about Joseph. He hadn't wanted to, but Mrs. Carter was sharp, and she missed nothing. He sighed. "It's complicated," she snorted. "Life always is." She wiped her hands on her apron. "But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the past has a funny way of showing up when you least expect it." Joshua stared down at the dough in front of him, feeling the truth of her words settle over him like a weight. And then, the front door swung open. The bell jingled, but something about the sound sent a shiver down Joshua's spine. A man walked in. Tall, sharp features, an expensive suit that didn't belong in a place like this. His presence was wrong. Joshua immediately recognized him. Harris Denton, one of his father's men. His blood ran cold. Mrs. Carter must have sensed the shift in atmosphere because she turned toward the newcomer, narrowing her eyes. "You lost, sweetheart." Harris barely acknowledged her. His gaze landed directly on Joshua. "We need to talk." Joshua wiped his hands on a towel and stepped forward. "We don't have anything to talk about." Harris smirked, pulling out a business card and placing it on the counter. "Your father disagrees." Joshua let out a slow breath, anger bubbling beneath his skin. "I don't care what my father thinks." Harris tilted his head. "I think you might, especially once you find out that your little bakery is in trouble." Joshua's eyes narrowed. "What the hell are you talking about?" Harris tapped the business card. "Health inspectors, someone tipped them off about violations in the kitchen." He glanced around the shop with a fake look of sympathy. "Would be a shame if Carter's bakery had to shut down over some unexpected findings." Joshua's stomach dropped. This was a game, a warning. Joseph was pulling strings, trying to make his life collapse from the outside in. Mrs. Carter scoffed. "I run a damn clean bakery. There's nothing to find." Harris shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. But when the right people ask the wrong questions, things have a way of getting complicated." Joshua felt the rage rise inside him like a storm. His father wasn't just trying to pull him back. He was trying to destroy everything Joshua had built. He stepped closer, his voice low and controlled. "Tell my father that if he wants to come after me, he can do it to my face." Harris smiled, unfazed. "He doesn't have to. You'll come to him." He picked up a loaf of bread from the display, inspecting it before placing it back down, one way or another. With that, he turned and walked out, leaving behind nothing but silence and the sharp, lingering scent of threats unspoken. Joshua stared at the business card on the counter, his heart pounding in his chest. Mrs. Carter crossed her arms. That was bad. Joshua let out a slow breath. "Yeah." Megan walked in from the back, taking one look at his face. "What happened?" Joshua clenched his fists, staring at the door where Harris had just walked out. "My father just made his move. And if Joseph thought he could scare him into coming back, he was dead wrong. Joshua wasn't running anymore. This time, he was fighting back." Joshua had spent most of his life playing by his father's rules, following expectations, meeting impossible standards. living under the weight of a last name that dictated every move he made, but not anymore. Standing in the middle of Carter's bakery, staring at the business card Harris Denton had left on the counter, he felt something shift inside him, a slow-burning anger, a refusal to be controlled. Joseph Morgan thought he could scare him. He thought he could pull strings and force Joshua back into line, but he was wrong. Megan placed a gentle hand on his arm. Josh. What did he mean about the bakery being in trouble? Joshua exhaled, his fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. It's a power play. My father wants me to crawl back, and he thinks the easiest way to do that is by taking away everything I have left. Mrs. Carter, who had been silently watching, scoffed. That man can go to hell. This bakery has been running longer than his fancy business has. He thinks he can shut me down. She gestured around her shop. I built this place with my own hands. I don't scare easy. Joshua smirked. Yeah, I figured. Mrs. Carter crossed her arms. What are we dealing with? Some made-up violations, fines, bribes? Joshua sighed. Most likely, if my father wants something to happen, he finds a way to make it happen. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. Mrs. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. Then we won't make it easy for him. Joshua nodded, but his mind was already racing. How far would his father take this? If Joseph wanted to, he could have the bakery shut down permanently. He had the money, the lawyers, and the influence to make it disappear overnight. And if that happened, Joshua wouldn't just be losing a job. He'd be losing his future, their future. Megan, who had been silent for too long, finally spoke, her voice steady. Then we fight back. Joshua turned to her, surprised by the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just saying it to comfort him. She meant it. This bakery is important to you, she continued. To us, we're not going to let your father take that away. Joshua felt something stir in his chest. Megan had always been strong, but this was different. This was war, and they were in it together. That night, Joshua couldn't sleep. His mind wouldn't stop racing, running through every possible way his father could sabotage them. If Joseph was willing to play dirty, Joshua had to be one step ahead. Finally, unable to stay still, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There was only one person who might have answers. He hesitated before pressing call. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Josh. Joshua exhaled. Hey, Mom. Eleanor's voice softened. I was hoping you'd call. Joshua sat on the edge of the bed, his voice low. Tell me the truth. How far will he go? His mother sighed, as if she had been expecting the question. Joshua, you know your father. He doesn't like losing control. Joshua's jaw tightened. Yeah, I figured. But this isn't just about me anymore. He's coming after people who have nothing to do with this. He's trying to ruin lives just to get to me. Eleanor was silent for a long moment. Then she said something that chilled him to the core. This isn't the first time he's done something like this. Joshua's grip on the phone tightened. What do you mean? Eleanor hesitated, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter. Linda Foster wasn't the only one. Joshua's stomach twisted. Who else? There were others, employees who got too close, who asked too many questions, who tried to fight back. She let out a shaky breath. Your father doesn't destroy people all at once. He does it slowly. He makes them think they can win. Then he takes everything. Joshua closed his eyes. This was bigger than just him. Joseph had been doing this for years, silencing people, controlling them, ruining them. And if Joshua didn't do something, Carter's bakery would be next. I have to stop him, he muttered. His mother's voice was almost sad. I know. Joshua opened his eyes, a new determination settling in his chest. Joseph wanted to destroy everything Joshua had built. Fine. Joshua would burn down everything his father had built instead. The next morning, he arrived at the bakery before sunrise. Mrs. Carter was already there, unlocking the door when he walked up. She glanced at him. You look like you haven't slept. Joshua smirked. Haven't. She opened the door. Stepping inside. That means you've got a plan. Joshua followed her in, rolling up his sleeves. Yeah, but we need to move fast. Megan arrived a few minutes later, looking at both of them curiously. What's going on? Joshua turned to her, his eyes burning with resolve. We're going to expose him. Megan frowned. Your father. Joshua nodded. He's been doing this for years. Blackmail, sabotage, ruining people's lives just to keep control. If we try to fight him the way he expects, we'll lose. So we're going to hit him where it hurts." Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow. "And where's that?" Joshua smirked. "His reputation." Joseph Morgan was a master of manipulation. He controlled people through fear and power. But there was one thing he couldn't afford to lose: his public image. If they could gather proof, real, undeniable proof, of what Joseph had done to Linda Foster, to other employees, to anyone who had crossed him, then even he wouldn't be able to talk his way out of it. Megan crossed her arms. "And how exactly do we get that proof?" Joshua's smirk widened. "I know exactly where to start." Megan tilted her head. "Where?" Joshua leaned against the counter. "My mother." Eleanor had been trapped in Joseph's world for decades. But she wasn't blind. She had seen things, heard things that could ruin him if they came to light. And now, for the first time, she was willing to talk. This wasn't just about saving the bakery anymore. It was about ending Joseph Morgan's reign. For good. Joshua clenched his fists, his mind sharper than it had ever been. His father had started this war. Now, Joshua was going to finish it. Joshua sat on the small patio outside the bakery, his phone gripped tightly in his hand. The early morning air was crisp, the sun barely beginning to rise over the quiet streets of Austin. Today was the day. His mother had agreed to meet him, after everything that had happened, after years of watching his father destroy lives. Eleanor Morgan had finally reached her breaking point. Joshua could still hear the hesitation in her voice from their last call. "There are things I know, Joshua. Things that could change everything." He hadn't needed to ask twice. Now, sitting there, waiting for her to arrive, he could feel the weight of what was coming pressing down on him. If his mother really had the proof he needed, if she was finally willing to speak out against Joseph, there was no turning back. The sound of a car pulling up snapped him out of his thoughts. A sleek black sedan came to a slow stop at the curb. Joshua stood as the door opened and Eleanor Morgan stepped out, her designer sunglasses shielding her eyes. Her perfectly tailored coat wrapped around her like armor. She had always been elegant, poised, a woman who carried the weight of being Joseph Morgan's wife without ever showing the cracks beneath the surface. But today, something was different. Today, she looked tired. She walked toward him with measured steps. Stopping just short of the patio table, Joshua studied her carefully. "You came." Eleanor let out a quiet breath. "Of course I did." They sat for a moment. Neither of them spoke. It had been too long since they had last seen each other. Too much left unsaid. Finally, Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a small black folder. She placed it on the table between them, her manicured fingers resting lightly on top of it. "This," she said, her voice quieter now, "is everything I know." Joshua hesitated before picking up the folder. It felt heavier than it should have. Inside, he found documents, old reports, letters, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even realized he was missing. "There are records in there," Eleanor continued, "of payoffs your father made, not just to employees, but to lawyers, investigators, anyone who could have posed a problem for him." Joshua flipped through the pages, his stomach twisting with each new revelation. Linda Foster's name was there. Her firing hadn't been a coincidence. His father had orchestrated it, fabricated evidence to make it look like she was stealing, then made sure no one would ever question it, and worse, there were others, names he didn't recognize, but whose stories were painfully familiar. Employees who had gotten too close to the truth, people whose lives had been quietly ruined. Just like Megan's mother, Joshua's hands clenched into fists. His father had done this for years, and he had gotten away with it. Until now. Eleanor watched him carefully. "I don't know what you plan to do with this, Joshua, but once you go down this path, there's no undoing it." Joshua met her gaze. "I don't want to undo it," his mother exhaled, shaking her head. "I used to tell myself that he was just protecting his business, that he was doing what was necessary." She looked away, her voice softer now. "But that was a lie, wasn't it?" Joshua didn't answer. He didn't need to. Eleanor nodded to herself, as if finally accepting the truth. "He will try to stop you." Joshua closed the folder, his expression hard as stone. Let him try. Later that evening, back at their apartment, Joshua spread the documents across the table. Megan sat beside him, her expression tight as she scanned the pages. "This is it," she murmured. "This is the proof." Joshua nodded. "Now we just have to figure out what to do with it." Megan looked up at him, something sharp in her gaze. "We go public." Joshua hesitated. "You really think that's the best way?" She leaned forward. "Josh, your father has spent his entire life covering up the truth. If we try to fight him in private, he'll bury this before anyone even knows it exists." She pointed at the papers. "But if we make this public, if we bring it to a journalist, to someone who can expose the whole thing, he won't be able to hide it anymore." Joshua exhaled slowly. She was right. Joseph's power came from controlling the narrative. The only way to stop him was to take that control away. "I know someone," Megan added after a moment. "A journalist. I met him a few years ago when he did a piece on small businesses. He's legit, and he's not afraid to take on powerful people." Joshua studied her. "You trust him?" Megan nodded. "I do." Joshua ran a hand over his face, thinking fast. His father would come after them. He had no doubt about that. But for once, he wasn't going to let fear decide for him. He reached for his phone. "Call him," he said. Megan didn't hesitate. She picked up her phone and dialed. Joshua listened as she spoke to the journalist, giving him a brief but clear explanation of what they had. He could hear the intrigue in the man's voice, the immediate hunger for the truth. A meeting was set. Tomorrow. Joshua hung up and turned to Megan. "This is it." She met his gaze. "Are you ready for this?" Joshua let out a slow breath. No, but he was doing it anyway, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't running from his father. He was running toward the truth, and he was ready to burn Joseph Morgan's empire to the ground. The next morning, Joshua sat in a small cafe across from Ethan Hayes, the journalist Megan had reached out to. Ethan was younger than Joshua expected, mid-30s, sharp-eyed, and with an air of calm confidence that suggested he had seen his fair share of fights against powerful men. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, you're telling me you have evidence that Joseph Morgan, the Joseph Morgan, has been blackmailing employees, fabricating charges, and ruining lives to protect his empire?" Joshua placed the black folder on the table between them. "I'm not telling you. I'm showing you." Ethan reached for the folder, flipping through the pages. His eyes moved quickly, scanning document after document. As he read, his expression shifted. First curiosity, then disbelief, and finally something darker. He let out a low whistle. "Jesus, this is substantial." He looked up at Joshua. "Where did you get this?" Joshua hesitated for half a second before saying, "My mother." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Eleanor Morgan." Joshua nodded. Ethan exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "That's unexpected. Tell me about it?" Joshua muttered. Megan, sitting beside him, cleared her throat. "Ethan, if you publish this story, Joseph will come after you. Hard." Ethan smirked, tapping the folder. "If I was afraid of powerful men, I'd be writing about celebrity diets and real estate trends." He closed the folder. "This is real, and if it's legit, I want to be the one to take it public." Joshua studied him. "How do we make sure this doesn't get buried?" Ethan's smirk widened. "We make it loud. We don't just write an article. We launch a full-scale report, interviews, leaked documents, financial records. We expose him from every angle." He tapped the folder again. "You said your mother was willing to talk." Joshua nodded. "She knows more than what's in there, and if she's finally willing to go against him, then she'll back it up." Ethan's eyes lit up. "A whistleblower from inside the Morgan family. That's gold." Joshua's stomach twisted. He knew what this meant for his mother. She wasn't just stepping out of Joseph's shadow. She was stepping into a war, and so was he. Ethan checked his watch. "I'll need to verify these documents, cross-check sources, but if everything checks out, I'll have a first draft ready within a week." Joshua clenched his jaw. "That fast?" Ethan smiled. "You want to fight your father, Morgan. You do it before he sees you coming." That evening, back at their apartment, Joshua sat with Megan, the weight of the day pressing down on him. Megan reached for his hand. "How are you feeling?" Joshua let out a dry laugh. "Like I just declared war on a man who doesn't lose." Megan squeezed his hand. Then we'll make sure he loses." Joshua looked at her, his chest tightening. She believed in him, in this fight, in what they were doing. And for the first time, he truly believed it too. A sudden knock on the door shattered the moment. Joshua's body tensed instantly. Megan glanced at him. "Are you expecting someone?" Joshua shook his head. Slowly, he got up, stepping toward the door. His heartbeat pounded as he checked the peephole. A sharp shock of anger and disbelief shot through him. It was Harris Denton. Joshua threw open the door. "What the hell do you want?" Harris smirked. "Good to see you too, kid." He looked past Joshua, spotting Megan inside. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Joshua stepped out, shutting the door behind him. "You have 5 seconds before I slam this door in your face." Harris chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Relax. I'm just the messenger." Joshua folded his arms. "Then deliver the message and get lost." Harris's smirk faded. "Joseph wants to meet," Joshua scoffed. "Not happening." Harris shrugged. "Suit yourself, but he's willing to negotiate." Joshua's eyes narrowed. Joseph Morgan did not negotiate. "He knows about the journalist," Harris continued. "He knows what you're planning." His gaze turned colder. "And he wants to make you an offer before you do something you'll regret." Joshua felt fury rise in his chest. "The only thing I regret is not exposing him sooner." Harris sighed, rubbing his temple. "Look, Josh, I've worked for your father a long time. I know how this goes. If you push him, he'll push back harder. This isn't a fight you can win." Joshua stepped closer, his voice dangerously low. "Then he's finally going to learn what it feels like to lose." Harris studied him for a long moment. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. "All right, have it your way." He turned to leave, but paused. "One last thing. If you go through with this, you better be ready, because once that story is out, there's no going back." Joshua didn't flinch. "Good." Harris nodded once, then walked off into the night. Joshua stood there, his chest rising and falling with adrenaline. When he finally stepped back inside, Megan was already waiting. What was that about? Joshua took a deep breath. "Joseph knows." Megan's face darkened. "So what do we do?" Joshua clenched his fists. "We finish this." He picked up his phone and dialed Ethan. The journalist answered on the first ring. "Morgan, run the story," Joshua said, his voice steady, unwavering. "Expose him." Ethan paused, then let out a slow breath. "You sure?" Joshua's grip tightened on the phone. Joseph had controlled him his entire life, but not anymore. "I'm sure," he said. And with that, the battle truly began. The morning after Joshua made the call, the world exploded. It started with a headline. Exclusive: The Dark Empire of Joseph Morgan. Corruption, sabotage, and the lives destroyed in the name of power. The article dropped at exactly 6 a.m. By 7:30, it was everywhere. News outlets picked up the story. Social media caught fire. The name Joseph Morgan trended worldwide, but not for the reasons he would have wanted. Joshua sat in the apartment staring at his phone as notification after notification poured in. His heart pounded as he skimmed the article, even though he already knew what it contained. Ethan had held nothing back. It was all there. The payoffs, the fabricated accusations, the employees Joseph had silenced over the years, including Linda Foster. Megan's mother's story was woven into the larger narrative of Morgan Industries' ruthless history, painting a picture of a man who built an empire on the destruction of others. Then, the final blow. Eleanor Morgan's statement. She had spoken to Ethan on record, confirming that Joseph had manipulated, intimidated, and even orchestrated firings to maintain control. For the first time, someone from inside his own family had turned against him. Joshua exhaled, his grip on his phone tightening. This was it, the point of no return. Megan sat beside him, scrolling through her own phone. "People are furious, Josh. He can't cover this up." Joshua looked at her, his chest tightening. "I know." And yet, deep down, a part of him was still waiting for the moment Joseph would strike back. Because Joseph Morgan never went down without a fight. By noon, the first official statement from Morgan Industries was released. Joshua had expected damage control, empty words about integrity, denials, maybe even an attempt to paint himself as the victim. But he hadn't expected silence. No press conference. No rebuttal. No legal threats. Nothing. That was more terrifying than any public statement, because that meant Joseph was planning something. Joshua paced the apartment, restless, uneasy. "He's not going to let this go," he muttered. Megan looked up from her laptop. He might not have a choice. She gestured to the screen. Companies are already distancing themselves. His business partners, his investors, they're pulling out. Joshua crossed his arms. "So that's it. It's just happening." Megan met his gaze, her voice steady. "Josh, this isn't just some scandal. This is exposure on a national level. Your father isn't invincible anymore." Joshua wanted to believe that. He really did. But he knew Joseph Morgan too well. It wasn't until late that night that the first crack appeared. Joshua's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. Blocked number. His stomach twisted. He already knew who it was. Without a word, he answered. A beat of silence. Then, a voice. Calm. Composed. But laced with something darker. "You have no idea what you've done." Joshua's fingers curled into fists. "Oh, I think I do." Joseph exhaled sharply. "You think this is a victory? That you've won?" A dry, humorless chuckle. "You don't win against me, Joshua. You just delay the inevitable." Joshua clenched his jaw. "You're done, Dad. The world knows who you are. It's over." Another silence. Then, Joseph's voice dropped. "You are no longer my son." Joshua's breath caught in his throat. Not because it hurt, not anymore, but because there was no anger in Joseph's voice, only cold finality. For a second, Joshua felt a ghost of the boy he used to be, the one who had spent his whole life fighting for this man's approval. But then, he let that boy go. He exhaled slowly. "I stopped being your son the day you tried to control my life." A beat of silence. Then, the call ended. Joshua lowered the phone, his heart pounding. Megan touched his arm. "Josh." He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "It's done," he said. "I don't think he's going to fight back." Megan frowned. "That's not like him." Joshua nodded. "I know." And that was what scared him the most. The next morning, the world shifted again. Joseph Morgan resigned. Joshua nearly dropped his phone when he saw the headline, "Morgan Industries CEO steps down amid corruption allegations. Company in freefall." The article was brief. To the point, Joseph had released one final statement, citing a need to step away and allow the company to move forward without distraction. It was a lie, of course. He wasn't stepping away. He was being forced out. Joshua exhaled, rubbing his face. It was really happening. His father's empire was crumbling, and for the first time, Joshua was free. Megan walked up behind him, looking at his phone. "He's really gone." Joshua nodded slowly. "Yeah." Megan let out a soft breath. "How do you feel?" Joshua thought about it. For years, he had imagined this moment, breaking free from his father, proving that he could survive on his own. And yet, now that it was here, he didn't feel triumphant. He just felt lighter. He looked at Megan, at the life they had built in Austin, at what mattered. "I feel..." He searched for the right word. Then finally he found it. "Ready?" Megan smiled, slipping her arms around him. "Good." Because for the first time, the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. And Joshua Morgan was finally free to live it. The morning after Joseph Morgan's resignation, the world felt different. For the first time in his life, Joshua wasn't looking over his shoulder. There were no more battles to fight, no more schemes to uncover, no more waiting for his father to make the next move. It was over. He sat at the small kitchen table in their apartment, a cup of coffee in front of him, staring at the newspaper spread across the surface. The headline read, "The Fall of a Titan. Joseph Morgan's resignation marks the end of an era." Joshua ran his fingers over the bold letters, letting the reality of it sink in. His father was gone, not in the physical sense. Joseph was still out there, somewhere, licking his wounds, nursing his pride. But the power, the control, the influence that had defined his entire life, that was gone. Joshua had spent so long fighting to prove himself, to escape the weight of his last name. Now that he had, he expected to feel more, but instead, He just felt free. Megan walked into the kitchen, her hair still damp from the shower, her growing belly just barely visible under the oversized sweater she wore. She stopped when she saw him staring at the paper. "Still trying to believe it?" she asked softly. Joshua smirked. "Something like that." She stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did it, Josh." He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, I did." Megan sat across from him, watching him carefully. "So, what now?" That was the question. Wasn't it? For so long, his future had been tied to his father's expectations. Even after he left, he had still been running from them, still proving, to himself, to the world, that he could survive without Joseph Morgan's money, his influence, his name. But now there was nothing left to run from, and that meant, for the first time, he had to figure out what he actually wanted. Joshua looked at Megan, at the woman who had stood beside him through all of it, at the life they had built together, simple but real. "I think," he paused, considering his words. "I think I just want to live." Megan smiled. "That's a good start." Later that day, Joshua walked through the doors of Carter's bakery like he did every morning, but today felt different. "Mrs." Carter looked up from the register, eyeing him over the rim of her glasses. "You gonna stand there looking dramatic, or are you actually gonna do some work?" Joshua chuckled. "Morning to you too, Mrs. Carter," she smirked. "You see the news?" Joshua leaned against the counter. "Yeah, it's all over." Mrs. Carter nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. "So, what does that mean for you?" Joshua hesitated. "I don't know yet." She studied him for a long moment before nodding toward the back. "Well, until you figure it out, there's dough that needs kneading." Joshua grinned. "On it." That afternoon, as Joshua was finishing up, he heard the bell above the door chime. He glanced up and froze. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Morgan. She looked out of place, dressed in elegant designer clothes that didn't belong in a cozy neighborhood bakery. But there was something different about her, something softer in the way she carried herself. Joshua wiped his hands on his apron and walked toward her. "Mom," she smiled, a little hesitant. "Joshua." For a moment, they just stood there, neither sure how to begin. Finally, Eleanor sighed. "I wanted to see you." Joshua folded his arms. "Why now?" Her gaze flickered around the bakery, taking in the warm atmosphere, the quiet buzz of customers chatting over pastries. "I guess I just wanted to see the life you chose." Joshua exhaled. "And?" Eleanor's lips curved into a small smile. "I think you chose well." Joshua felt something tighten in his chest. His mother had never said that before, never told him she was proud, never acknowledged that he had made the right decision. He swallowed. "You really mean that?" She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I do." For the first time in years, Joshua felt like her son again. That evening, Joshua and Megan sat on their tiny balcony, watching the sunset over the Austin skyline. The bakery was closed. The city was quiet. And for once, so was Joshua's mind. Megan leaned her head against his shoulder. "So, I have a crazy idea." Joshua chuckled. "That's never a good start." She smirked. "What if we open our own bakery?" Joshua blinked. "What?" Megan sat up, her eyes bright with excitement. "Think about it. You love baking. You love creating something with your own hands. And now that you're free, you can do anything. Why not do something that makes you happy?" Joshua let the idea settle in his mind. His own bakery, his own business. Something he built, not because of his father, not because of expectations, but because he wanted to. Slowly, a smile spread across his lips. "You know, that's not a bad idea." Megan grinned. "I know." Joshua pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Then let's do it." Megan beamed. "Really?" Joshua looked out at the city, at the life they were building together. For the first time, his future was truly his own. "Yeah," he said, "let's build something great." And this time, it would belong to them. 1 year later, the smell of fresh bread and vanilla filled the air as Joshua rolled up the sleeves of his chef's coat. Dusting his hands with flour, the morning rush had just ended, leaving the bakery in a comfortable lull, quiet enough to breathe, but still alive with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of coffee cups. The sign above the door read, Foster and Morgan Bakery, their legacy. Joshua looked around. Taking in the space they had built, sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the rustic wooden tables, the glass display case filled with freshly baked pastries, and the small chalkboard sign near the register that read, Welcome home. And that's exactly what it felt like. Home. Megan stepped out from the kitchen, her apron tied neatly around her waist, her long hair pulled into a messy bun. She wiped her hands on a towel and smiled at him. We survived the morning rush. Joshua smirked. Barely. Megan placed a tray of warm cinnamon rolls onto the counter. I told you we'd need to bake extra today. Joshua raised an eyebrow. I refuse to believe people eat this many pastries. Megan laughed. Josh, we literally own a bakery. He shook his head, amused, as he reached for one of the cinnamon rolls and took a bite. Okay, fine. Maybe you're right. She nudged his shoulder playfully before glancing toward the back of the shop. How's he doing? She asked softly. Joshua's gaze followed hers toward the small playpen near the back corner of the bakery, where a tiny 1-year-old boy was happily babbling to himself, surrounded by stuffed animals and toy baking utensils. Their son, Caleb. Joshua smiled, his heart swelling as he watched the little boy clutch a toy rolling pin in his chubby fingers, banging it against the side of his playpen. He's going to take over the business by the time he's 3, Joshua joked. Megan grinned. Well, he does have a strong-willed father. Joshua turned to her, his expression soft. And a mother who never stops believing in us. Megan's eyes warmed as she stepped closer, pressing a gentle kiss to his lips. We built this, Josh. We made this life, together. Joshua exhaled, letting the truth of that settle inside him. For so long, he had been afraid that he would never be enough, that without his father's name, without his fortune, without the path that had been laid out for him, he would fail. But here he was, successful, fulfilled, happy, and he had done it without Joseph Morgan's power, without his control. He had done it on his own terms. The sound of the bakery door opening pulled Joshua from his thoughts. He turned, expecting a customer, but when he saw who it was, he froze. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Morgan. She looked different than the last time he had seen her. Lighter. She no longer carried the weight of being Joseph Morgan's wife. No longer had the tense, carefully composed expression she had worn for so many years. She was free. She stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes scanning the bakery. It's beautiful, she said softly. Joshua swallowed before speaking. Thanks. Eleanor's gaze landed on Caleb, and something flickered across her face. Something fragile. Longing. He's grown so much. Joshua nodded. Yeah, he has. Eleanor hesitated before asking, May I? Joshua looked at Megan, who nodded encouragingly. He exhaled before stepping aside, allowing his mother to approach the playpen. Caleb looked up, his wide, curious eyes locking onto hers. Eleanor knelt down, reaching out a hand cautiously. Caleb studied her for a moment before grabbing her fingers, giggling. Eleanor let out a small, choked laugh. He's perfect. Joshua felt something tighten in his chest. For years he had resented her, for staying with Joseph, for allowing him to control their lives. But now, looking at her with Caleb, he realized something. She had escaped too. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to build something new. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes glassy. I know I wasn't the mother you needed me to be back then, Joshua, but I'd like to try now. If you'll let me. Joshua exhaled. The wounds between them wouldn't heal overnight. There were years of silence, of missed moments, of choices that couldn't be undone. But he wasn't the same person he had been. He had learned that family wasn't about blood or legacy or expectations. It was about choosing each other, again and again. And right now, looking at his mother with his son, he was willing to try. He nodded. Yeah, we can try. Eleanor let out a soft breath of relief, blinking away tears. Megan stepped closer, wrapping her fingers around Joshua's hand. Joshua looked at her, at Caleb, at the bakery, the life they had created, a life free from the past, a life they had chosen. And as the scent of warm bread and cinnamon filled the air, as Caleb giggled in his grandmother's arms. As Megan squeezed his hand, Joshua Morgan knew with absolute certainty he had won.